He was rejected in 18 job interviews over 8 months, each rejection chipping away at his confidence until he questioned everything about his worth. Today, he runs a recruitment agency that has placed over 500 people in their dream jobs and has a waiting list of companies begging him to find their next employees. David Chen thought he had everything figured out when he graduated with his business degree. 24 years old, solid GPA, internship experience at a respected marketing firm, and the kind of optimism that comes from believing the world is waiting for your contribution. His professors had praised his analytical thinking. His internship supervisor had written a glowing recommendation letter, and his resume looked polished and professional. The first few rejections didn't worry him. Everyone knew that job hunting took time, and David figured it was just a matter of finding the right fit. He applied to marketing coordinator positions, business analyst roles, and entry-level management opportunities, confident that his combination of education and enthusiasm would eventually open the right door. But rejection number 5 stung differently than the first 4.
We've decided to move forward with a candidate who has more direct industry experience, the hiring manager explained during a brief phone call that lasted maybe 90 seconds. David thanked her professionally, hung up, and stared at his computer screen, wondering how he was supposed to get industry experience if no one would hire him without it. Rejection number 8 came with feedback that contradicted rejection number 7.
One company said he seemed too academic and needed more practical skills. The previous company had said he lacked the theoretical foundation they were looking for. David started wondering if there was something fundamentally wrong with him that he couldn't see, but everyone else could. By rejection 12, David's confidence was crumbling.
He'd started each interview feeling prepared and hopeful, but now he walked into interviews already anticipating failure. His answers became tentative instead of confident. His energy felt forced instead of genuine, and he could see the shift in interviewers' expressions when they sensed his uncertainty. His parents tried to be supportive, but David could hear the worry in their voices during their weekly phone calls. His college friends were landing jobs, posting LinkedIn updates about new positions and exciting opportunities, while David's profile remained stubbornly static. The gap between his expectations and reality was becoming impossible to ignore. Rejection 15 came from a company where David thought he'd finally nailed the interview. He'd connected with the team, answered every question confidently, and left feeling genuinely excited about the possibility of working there. When the rejection email arrived 3 days later, David didn't just feel disappointed. He felt confused and lost. After careful consideration, we've decided not to move forward with your application. While you have many positive qualities, we felt other candidates were a stronger fit for our company culture. Company culture. David had heard this phrase in multiple rejection letters, but he had no idea what it actually meant or how he was supposed to demonstrate fit for something so vague and undefined. He was qualified for the roles. He interviewed well enough to make it to final rounds, but somehow he kept failing at this mysterious culture test. The worst part wasn't the rejections themselves. It was the way they made David question everything about who he was and what he had to offer. Each no felt like confirmation that there was something deficient about him that he couldn't identify or fix.
He started analyzing every interaction, every answer, every gesture, trying to figure out what invisible quality he was missing. Rejection 18 came on a Friday afternoon in March, 8 months after David had started his job search. By this point, he'd exhausted most of the obvious opportunities in his area and was applying to positions that felt like settling rather than pursuing.
This particular rejection was for an entry-level administrative role that he was overqualified for, but David had applied anyway because he desperately needed income and purpose. We appreciate your interest, but we've chosen to move forward with another candidate who we believe will be a better long-term fit for this position. David sat in his childhood bedroom, surrounded by printed job listings and interview preparation notes, and felt something break inside him. Not just disappointment or frustration, but a deep, crushing realization that maybe the problem wasn't the companies, or the market, or bad luck. Maybe the problem was him. That weekend, David barely left his room. His mother knocked occasionally, offering food or asking if he wanted to talk. But David couldn't imagine explaining how completely defeated he felt. He'd done everything he was supposed to do, got good grades, gained relevant experience,
polished his interview skills, networked professionally, and none of it mattered.
Sunday evening, David found himself reviewing all 18 rejection letters, looking for patterns or insights that might help him understand what was going wrong. But instead of finding answers, he discovered something that would completely change his perspective on the entire job search process. The rejections weren't just random disappointments. They were data.
Each letter revealed something specific about what companies were looking for, what they valued, and how they made hiring decisions. More importantly, the letters revealed the massive disconnect between what job seekers thought companies wanted and what companies actually needed. David had been approaching job interviews like tests, where he needed to provide correct answers to predetermined questions. But what if the real challenge was something completely different? What if companies were struggling just as much as job seekers, trying to find the right people, but using broken systems and unclear criteria? For the first time in 8 months, David felt a spark of curiosity instead of desperation.
What if his 18 rejections weren't evidence of his failure, but research data for understanding a problem that affected everyone involved in hiring? David spent the next week doing something that no career counselor had ever suggested. He analyzed his rejections like a business case study. He created a spreadsheet documenting every company, every position, every interview question, and every piece of feedback he'd received.
What emerged was a pattern that nobody talks about in job search advice. The companies weren't rejecting him because he was unqualified. They were rejecting him because they had no idea what they actually needed. Take rejection number 6, for example. The marketing manager had asked David to describe his experience with growth hacking strategies, and seemed disappointed when David admitted he was more familiar with traditional marketing approaches.
But when David researched the company afterward, he discovered they were a conservative B2B manufacturer, whose biggest marketing challenge was explaining complex industrial products to potential customers. Exactly the kind of analytical communication challenge that David's background had prepared him for. Or rejection 14, where the startup founder had emphasized their need for someone who could think outside the box and move fast and break things. David had tried to demonstrate creativity and flexibility, but the founder seemed unimpressed. Later, David learned through LinkedIn that the company was struggling with basic operational issues, like inventory management and customer service. Problems that required systematic thinking and careful attention to detail, not creative chaos. The more David analyzed, the clearer it became that most companies were using hiring processes designed around buzzwords and generic job descriptions, rather than their actual challenges and needs. They asked for cultural fit without defining their culture. They wanted innovative thinkers when they needed reliable execution. They emphasized growth mindset when they desperately needed someone who could organize their existing operations. But David's biggest insight came from looking at the companies where he'd made it to final interview rounds. In every case, the moment when he'd felt most confident and connected was when the conversation shifted from generic interview questions to specific business challenges. When interviewers described real problems they were facing, David naturally started problem solving and asking clarifying questions. Those were the moments when his analytical strengths became obvious and valuable. The problem wasn't that David lacked what companies needed. The problem was that traditional interview processes were terrible at identifying what companies actually needed and matching that with what candidates could actually provide. This realization led David to an experiment that would change everything. Instead of applying to more positions through traditional channels, David decided to approach companies directly with a different proposition. He would research their actual business challenges, develop preliminary insights about potential solutions, and offer to spend a day working with them as a consultant to demonstrate his value before any formal hiring discussion. His first test was a local digital marketing agency that had rejected him 6 months earlier for a marketing coordinator role. David had noticed in their recent social media posts that they were struggling with client retention. Multiple posts apologizing for delayed deliverables and promising better communication. David spent 3 days researching the agency's client testimonials, case studies, and online reviews. The pattern was clear. They were great at creating marketing strategies, but terrible at project management and client communication. Their clients loved the creative work, but were frustrated by missed deadlines and unclear progress updates. Instead of sending another resume, David created a simple presentation outlining the client retention challenge, and proposing a systematic approach to project management and communication that would address the specific issues he'd identified. Then he called the agency owner directly. "Hi, this is David Chen. I interviewed with you a few months ago for the marketing coordinator position. I know you went with another candidate, but I've been thinking about the client retention challenges I noticed in your recent social media activity. I have some ideas that might help, and I'd like to offer to spend a day working with your team to demonstrate how these solutions might work in practice. No cost, no obligation, just an opportunity to show how I could contribute to solving real problems you're facing." The agency owner, Jennifer, was initially skeptical, but agreed to a brief conversation. David's research had been thorough enough that Jennifer realized he understood their business challenges better than most of their current employees. She agreed to let him spend a day working with their team on a trial basis. That one day turned into a week-long project where David implemented a client communication system that eliminated most of their retention issues. Instead of hiring him for the original marketing coordinator role, Jennifer offered him a project management position at a higher salary than the job he'd been rejected for. But more importantly, David realized he'd discovered something powerful. A way to demonstrate value directly, instead of trying to convince people of value through interviews and resumes. Word spread quickly through Jennifer's professional network about the consultant who had solved their client retention problem in a week. Within a month, David had 3 more companies asking him to analyze their operational challenges and propose solutions. By the end of his 3rd month as an independent consultant, David was earning more than he would have made in any of the entry-level positions that had rejected him. But he was also learning something that would become the foundation for his future business. Most small and medium-sized companies had similar operational problems, and most job seekers had skills that could solve those problems. But traditional hiring processes were preventing these matches from happening. David had accidentally discovered that the hiring system itself was broken, and that understanding how it was broken created opportunities for everyone involved. 6 months into his consulting work, David had solved operational problems for 8 different companies and built a network of business owners who trusted his analytical approach. But he was also fielding calls from former classmates and friends who were struggling with the same job search frustrations he'd experienced. They wanted to know how he'd transitioned from rejection to success, and more importantly, how they could do something similar. The conversation that sparked David's next evolution came from his college friend Sarah, who called him one evening in tears of frustration. She'd been searching for a marketing role for 4 months, had multiple interviews but no offers, and was starting to question her career choice entirely. "I don't understand what they want," Sarah said. "Every job posting lists 20 different requirements, half of which seem to contradict each other. They want someone creative but also analytical, experienced but also fresh thinking, independent but also collaborative. How is anyone supposed to know what they actually need?" David listened to Sarah's frustration and realized she was describing the exact same disconnect he'd discovered during his own job search. Companies were using generic requirements that didn't reflect their real challenges, and job seekers were trying to position themselves as generic solutions rather than specific problem solvers. "What if I told you that most companies don't really know what they need until they see it in action?" David asked. "And what if I told you there's a way to show them what they need by demonstrating how you solve their actual problems?" David spent the next hour walking Sarah through his approach, research companies' real challenges, develop specific insights about solutions, and propose trial collaborations that demonstrate value before formal hiring discussions. Sarah was skeptical, but desperate enough to try something different. 2 weeks later, Sarah called David with excitement he hadn't heard in her voice for months. She'd landed a marketing role at a growing e-commerce company, not through their formal application process, but by identifying their customer retention challenge and proposing a trial project that showcased her analytical and creative skills simultaneously. "They didn't even know they had a retention problem until I showed them the data," Sarah explained. "But once they saw how I could analyze customer behavior and develop targeted re-engagement campaigns, they realized that's exactly what they needed. Now they're asking me to lead a whole customer lifecycle marketing initiative." Sarah's success confirmed what David had been suspecting. His approach wasn't just a personal solution to his own job search problems.
It was a systematic method for connecting skilled people with companies that needed their specific abilities. Over the next month, David refined his methodology and started helping other job seekers implement similar approaches. The process always followed the same steps: deep research into target companies' actual challenges, development of preliminary solutions that demonstrated relevant skills, and direct outreach that focused on value creation rather than credential presentation. But David quickly realized that scaling this approach required more than just teaching individuals how to research and reach out to companies. Many job seekers lacked the confidence to approach companies directly, and many companies were too busy dealing with operational challenges to respond to unsolicited outreach, even when that outreach offered genuine value.
The solution came when David recognized that he could serve as an intermediary, someone who understood both what companies actually needed and what job seekers could actually provide, and could facilitate connections that benefited everyone involved. David started reaching out to the business owners in his network with a different kind of proposition. Instead of offering his own consulting services, he offered to identify skilled professionals who could solve their specific operational challenges. The arrangement was simple. David would find, screen, and present candidates who had already demonstrated understanding of their business problems. Companies would get access to pre-qualified talent that was eager to contribute. Candidates would get opportunities to showcase their abilities in real-world contexts. His first formal placement was connecting a data analyst named Miguel with one of David's former consulting clients, a restaurant chain that was struggling with inventory management. Miguel had been rejected by multiple companies for not having restaurant industry experience. But David recognized that his analytical skills were exactly what the restaurant needed to optimize their ordering and reduce food waste. Instead of sending Miguel through traditional interview processes, David arranged for him to spend a week analyzing the restaurant's inventory data and developing optimization recommendations. By the end of that week, the restaurant owner had seen enough value to offer Miguel a full-time position as their operations analyst at a salary higher than the generic analyst roles that had rejected him. The placement was successful for everyone involved. Miguel got a role that utilized his strongest skills. The restaurant solved an expensive operational problem, and David had proven that his approach could work systematically, rather than just as individual success stories. Within 3 months, David had facilitated 12 similar placements, each one following the same pattern: identifying companies with specific operational challenges, finding candidates whose skills aligned with those challenges, and creating trial opportunities that allowed both sides to evaluate fit based on actual work rather than interview performance. But the real breakthrough came when David realized that his placement approach was generating something valuable beyond individual job matches: comprehensive insights about the hiring challenges that both companies and job seekers were facing. Companies consistently told David that traditional hiring processes wasted enormous amounts of time and rarely identified candidates who could actually contribute to solving their real problems. Job seekers consistently told David that traditional application processes made them feel like they were competing on irrelevant criteria rather than demonstrating their actual value. David had accidentally created a research laboratory for understanding what was broken about hiring and employment matching. Every placement provided data about what worked, what didn't work, and how the process could be improved for future candidates and companies. This insight led David to his next evolution. Instead of just facilitating individual placements, he could build a systematic approach to transforming how hiring actually worked. 18 months after his final rejection letter, David was running a recruitment agency that operated completely differently from traditional hiring firms. Instead of collecting resumes and conducting generic interviews, David had created what he called challenge-based placement, a system that connected talented people with companies by focusing on real problem solving rather than credential matching. The methodology that emerged from David's experience had 3 core components that revolutionized how both companies and candidates approached hiring. First was what David called problem discovery: systematic research into what challenges companies were actually facing versus what they thought they needed to hire for. David had learned that most job postings reflected generic templates rather than specific business needs, and that companies often hired for the wrong roles because they hadn't properly diagnosed their operational challenges. For each company client, David would spend a week conducting what he called operational interviews detailed conversations with different team members about their daily frustrations, bottlenecks, and inefficiencies. The goal wasn't to confirm their existing hiring plans, but to identify underlying problems that might require different solutions than they'd originally considered. A perfect example was TechFlow Solutions, a software company that contacted David about finding a senior developer to build new features for their product. But David's operational interviews revealed that their real challenge wasn't lack of development capacity. It was lack of organization around their existing development work. They had plenty of coding talent, but no systematic approach to project management, quality testing, or customer feedback integration. Instead of finding them another developer, David identified Sarah Martinez, a project coordinator with technical background who had been rejected by multiple tech companies for lacking sufficient coding experience. Sarah's combination of technical understanding and organizational skills was exactly what TechFlow needed to optimize their existing development resources. David arranged for Sarah to spend 2 weeks implementing project management systems for TechFlow's development team. By the end of the trial period, their development velocity had increased by 40%, bug reports had dropped significantly, and customer satisfaction with new features had improved dramatically. Sarah was offered a role as technical operations manager at a salary 20% higher than the generic developer position TechFlow had originally planned to fill. The second component was skills translation, helping candidates understand how their abilities applied to specific business challenges rather than trying to fit themselves into generic job categories. David had realized that most talented people were being rejected not because they lacked relevant skills, but because they couldn't articulate how their skills created value in business contexts. David worked with candidates to analyze their background and identify transferable capabilities that could solve real problems for companies. A former teacher named Kevin, who had been struggling to transition into corporate training roles, discovered through David's process that his classroom management and curriculum development skills were highly relevant to companies struggling with employee onboarding and retention challenges. Instead of applying for traditional training positions, Kevin worked with David to identify companies with high employee turnover and propose systematic onboarding improvements. His first placement was with a growing sales organization where his approach to structured learning and performance feedback reduced new employee turnover by 60% within 6 months. The third component was value demonstration, creating opportunities for candidates to showcase their problem-solving abilities in real business contexts before any formal hiring commitments. David had learned that traditional interviews were terrible predictors of actual job performance, but that well-designed trial projects provided accurate assessments of both skills and cultural fit. David's trial projects were specifically designed to simulate the actual challenges that successful candidates would face in their roles, while also delivering immediate value to the companies. Candidates got to demonstrate their capabilities in realistic conditions, companies got to evaluate performance based on actual results, and both sides could assess working relationship compatibility before making long-term commitments. The results of David's approach were remarkable for everyone involved. Companies using his challenge-based placement system reported that new hires were productive significantly faster than traditional hires, were more likely to stay long-term, and contributed to solving problems beyond their specific job descriptions. Candidates placed through David's system reported higher job satisfaction, faster career advancement, and greater confidence in their professional value. But the real transformation was in the economics of hiring itself. Traditional recruitment processes cost companies enormous amounts of time and money. Advertising positions, reviewing hundreds of applications, conducting multiple interview rounds, and dealing with failed hires who didn't work out. David's approach eliminated most of these costs by pre-qualifying matches based on demonstrated problem-solving capability. From the candidate perspective, David's system eliminated the soul-crushing experience of endless applications and rejections. Instead of competing against hundreds of other applicants based on resume keywords, candidates worked with David to identify opportunities where their specific skills created obvious value. Within 2 years, David's agency had placed over 200 professionals in roles that utilized their strongest capabilities while solving critical business challenges. His client companies were consistently reporting that placements made through his system outperformed traditional hires in productivity, retention, and overall contribution to business success. But perhaps most importantly, David had proven that the hiring challenges experienced by both companies and job seekers weren't inevitable features of the employment market. They were problems created by ineffective systems that could be solved through better approaches. David's 18 rejections had taught him that traditional hiring processes were broken for everyone involved. His response was to build something better, a systematic approach that connected talented people with meaningful opportunities based on their ability to create value, not their ability to navigate artificial selection processes. 5 years after those 18 crushing rejections, David stood in front of his team of 12 recruitment specialists, reviewing the quarterly numbers that still amazed him. They had placed over 500 professionals in meaningful roles, maintained a 95% retention rate after 2 years, and had a waiting list of companies hoping to access their challenge-based placement system. But the numbers that mattered most to David weren't about revenue or growth metrics. They were about the transformation stories that arrived in his inbox every week. Emails from people whose careers and lives had been fundamentally changed by discovering that their perceived weaknesses were actually their greatest professional strengths. Like the message he'd received that morning from Rachel Kim, a former graphic designer who had been rejected from multiple marketing roles for being too detail-oriented and not strategic enough. Through David's system, Rachel had been connected with a manufacturing company struggling with production quality issues. Her design background had trained her to notice small inconsistencies that others missed, and her attention to detail was exactly what the company needed to implement quality control systems that reduced defect rates by 80%. I spent 2 years thinking I was unemployable because I couldn't force myself to be less thorough, Rachel had written. Now, I'm the director of quality assurance, and my weakness has become the foundation for everything I do professionally. Thank you for helping me understand that the right fit changes everything. Or the story of Marcus Rodriguez, a military veteran who had struggled to translate his leadership experience into corporate terms that hiring managers could understand. Traditional interviews focused on his lack of business experience rather than his proven ability to coordinate complex operations under pressure. David had connected Marcus with a logistics company facing coordination challenges across multiple distribution centers. Marcus's systematic approach to operational planning had streamlined their processes and reduced delivery delays by 40% within 3 months. These stories reinforced something that David had learned through his own rejection experience. Most career challenges aren't about lack of capability or motivation. They're about misalignment between individual strengths and opportunity contexts. The traditional hiring system was designed around standardized requirements and generic skill categories. But real value creation happened when specific human capabilities met specific business challenges. David's agency had evolved into something more than a recruitment firm. It was a transformation platform that helped both companies and individuals understand what was actually needed for success, rather than what conventional wisdom suggested was important. The company's success had also allowed David to pursue the aspect of his work that felt most meaningful, developing resources and programs for people experiencing the kind of career crisis he'd gone through himself. Every month, David hosted free workshops for job seekers who were struggling with repeated rejections or career transitions. These sessions weren't about resume optimization or interview techniques. They were about helping people reframe their professional identity around value creation rather than credential presentation. The first thing to understand, David would tell workshop participants, is that rejection doesn't mean you're not valuable. It often means you're not connected with opportunities that need your specific type of value. Your job isn't to become what every company wants. It's to find the companies that need exactly what you already have to offer. David's workshops covered the methodology he developed for systematic job searching, how to research companies' actual operational challenges, how to translate personal skills into business solutions, and how to create opportunities for demonstrating value through trial collaborations rather than traditional interview processes. But perhaps most importantly, David shared his own story of transformation from rejected job seeker to successful business owner. He was transparent about the emotional difficulty of repeated rejection, the self-doubt that nearly convinced him to settle for opportunities far below his potential, and the mindset shifts that enabled him to recognize rejection as information rather than personal failure. My 18 rejections weren't evidence that I wasn't good enough, David would explain. They were research data that taught me how hiring actually works and how it could work better. Every rejection was showing me something about the disconnect between what companies say they want and what they actually need. The personal transformation aspect of David's work extended into his company's approach to employee development. Every recruitment specialist on his team had their own story of career struggle or transition, and David had learned that people who had experienced professional rejection themselves were more effective at helping others navigate similar challenges. His team included former teachers who had struggled to break into corporate training roles, military veterans who had difficulty translating their experience into civilian contexts, career changers who had been dismissed for lacking industry experience, and professionals who had been told they were overqualified for positions they genuinely wanted. This diversity of background created a recruitment team that understood career challenges from personal experience rather than theoretical training. They could recognize transferable skills that traditional recruiters missed, identify cultural fit indicators that standard interviews overlooked, and create trial opportunities that showcased capabilities in realistic contexts. David's business model had also inspired other entrepreneurs to develop similar approaches in different markets and industries. He regularly received calls from former clients who wanted to license his methodology or develop challenge-based placement systems for specific professional sectors. But David's greatest satisfaction came from knowing that his personal experience of rejection and recovery had been transformed into a systematic approach that prevented others from experiencing the same career crisis unnecessarily. Every placement his agency made represented someone who might otherwise have spent months or years questioning their professional worth, wondering why their capabilities weren't being recognized, or settling for opportunities that didn't utilize their strengths effectively. The best part of what we do, David reflected during a recent team meeting, isn't just that we help people find jobs. It's that we help them understand their professional value in ways that change how they approach their entire careers. David's story had come full circle. From 18 rejections that nearly destroyed his confidence to building a company that helped others transform their own rejection experiences into career breakthroughs. He had learned that failure often contains the blueprint for success, if you're willing to analyze it systematically, rather than just survive it emotionally. End of the story. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories of overcoming, and leave your comment below. Your message might brighten someone's day. See you in the next video.